Welcome, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So, new chapter. Again, continuing though, of course, Moses' speeches to the Jewish people on the onset of his demise, right? Ki yeviacha Hashem Elokecha, and I believe it means when here, when the Lord your God brings you El Haaretz to the land, Asher Tava Shama L'Rishta, which you are coming to in order to inherit it. V'nashal goyim rabim mipanecha, and he strikes off or he chips off many nations from before you. Hachiti, the Hittite, V'hagirgashi, the Girgashite, V'ha'emori, the Amorite, V'ha'knaani, and the Canaanite, V'ha'prizi, the Perizzite, V'ha'chivi, the Hivite, V'ha'yevusi, and the Jebusite, Shiv'a goyim, 7 nations, Rabim, numerous, I would say, V'atzumim mimeka, and mightier than you. So this word nashal is an interesting word here. As Rashi, so let me do the Rashi and then we can see. So he says, Lashon hashlacha. It has the connotation of casting off, v'hataza, and flying off. And he gives an example of another verse where this verb is used. And he says, similarly, in Deuteronomy 19, v'nashal habarzel, and the iron flies off. And the context of that particular section has to do with a situation of where someone is of manslaughter, and where one is chopping wood, and the axe head falls off or flies off, and strikes another person and kills them. So there's the word nashal, and what it means is like it flies off the axe handle. So this nashal means somehow the idea of them, the way in which they're going to be destroyed. They're just going to be stripped away. They're going to be chipped away, etc. Okay, going on. Unetanam Hashem Elokecha lefanecha, and the Lord your God will place them before you, vehikitam, and you shall smite them, vehacharem tacharim otam, you shall doom them to destruction. This is one of those difficult passages, right, that speak essentially of genocide. And it's disturbing. And again, the way in which I try to rationalize this is that it's limited to these particular nations. If we want to try and look at it from a historical point of view, or a semi-historical point of view, or else I would have to try and say that this has to do with various types of character traits within ourselves that we have to try and overcome. It's not an easy stretch. There are other stretches that are much easier, but otherwise, the only way I could either try to put it in a way that I would find more acceptable, and I'll finish up the sentence. Let me do this. Lo tichrot lahem brit, you shall not make a covenant with them. Velo techanem, and you shall show them no mercy. So again, the only way in which I can try and understand this is that the circumstances are specific, that we shouldn't look at this as a teaching to justify any future behavior like this, and on the positive side to say that what this is really trying to convey to us is the level of loyalty we need to show to our Creator. That's really what this is about. It's not so much about destroying nations as it is about trying to attempt to be loyal to God. And that is an issue and I think it's a relevant issue, and it's a positive issue, and that is to look into ourselves and ask ourselves, to what degree are we loyal to our Creator? That's the best I can do with this. Lo techanem. So Rashi has an interesting interpretation. This is from the Talmud. This is the Avodah Zarah, page 20. It says Avodat Gilulim, which means idol worship, but it's the name of this tractate that is generally called Avodah Zarah, that deals with the issues of idolatry. Lo, so he says, Lo techanem means Lo titen lahem chen. In other words, you shouldn't attribute or ascribe anything, any grace to them, anything positive, essentially, you'll see. Asur lo la adam, it's forbidden to a person, lomar, to say, Kama na'eh knaani zeh. In other words, how lovely is this Canaanite? Davar acher, another interpretation, lo titen lahem chaniya ba'aretz, you shall give them no encampment, no settlement in the land of Israel. Again, there's this danger of applying it nowadays, for example, to the Palestinians, etc. I haven't actually ever heard it stated like that, I'm glad to say, but it might well be a temptation amongst the ultra-religious to understand it that way. And I feel that I want to base it ultimately, my judgments in this regard on the fact that right at the very beginning of the Bible, it talks about God creating human beings in the divine image. And that the basic understanding of that is to understand that simply as a human being, not because you're an Israelite or anything else, but simply every single human being has this divine spark in them, and to make sure that we interpret any subsequent statements in the light of that. So when I come across these passages, and they are difficult passages in the sense that we've discussed now, I try to interpret them in ways in which I'm not speaking of genocide or anything or justifying any kind of cruelty, etc. Going on. So this I can understand better, right? What we're going on with. Lo titchaten bam, you shall not marry them. Bitcha lo titen livno, you shall not give your daughter to his son. Vito lo tikach levanecha, nor should you take his daughter for your son. Let's see if I don't think there's any Rashi on that. Make sure. Okay. Going on. Ki asir, and the reason not to do this. So now the Torah gives a justification for why this is happening. Ki asir et bincha me'acharai, for he will remove your son from after me, in other words, from following me. For avdu Elohim achirim, and they will serve other gods. V'chara af Hashem bachem, and the anger of the Lord will flare up against you. V'hishmitcha maher, and he will destroy you quickly. So there's no favoritism here, right? There is the expectation of a level of loyalty, and that if we don't show that, there will be consequences, and awful consequences. And of course, at this time of the year, as we approach Tisha B'Av, we recognize that this prediction actually came true, at least according to one of the interpretations as to why the temples were destroyed. Rashi, Ki asir et bincha me'acharai. So Rashi looks very carefully at the language here, because it says if you, let's see, this is if you, let's go back and see. Okay. We're talking about a male who marries a Canaanite woman, right? An Israelite male who marries a Canaanite woman, I believe, right? Let's just see. Okay. Let's go back and make sure that I've got this. Yeah, okay. All right, and that's the previous verse, right? You're right. It starts off by saying, you shall not give your daughter to his son, right? Okay, so going on this. Oops, went too far, forgive me. Here we are. Lo yasir pitcha me'acharai. He will remove your son from following me. And this is from Tractate Kiddushin, page 68. Bno shel Kanaani, so the son of a Canaanite, Keshiyisa et bicha, when he marries your daughter, Yasir et bincha asher teled lo, he will remove your son which she bears to him. Right? So it's a Canaanite male marrying an Israelite female, and we're considering their offspring, right? That if she has a son, in other words, your grandson, right, he is going to remove your grandson from following God, right? Lamadnu, and so we can infer from this, Sheben Bitcha, that is the son of your daughter, your grandson, through your daughter, Haba min Haknaani, who comes from a Canaanite. In other words, your daughter married a Canaanite, and you have a son from that union, Karui bincha. Nevertheless, he's called your son. Aval ben bincha haba min haknaanit, but a son, your grandson, the son of your son who comes from a Canaanite wife, eno karui bincha, is not called your son, ela b'na, but is called her son. Shaharei lo ne'emar al bito lo tikach, because it doesn't state here, right, that regarding his daughter, you know, when it says you shall not take his daughter, ki tasir et bincha, it doesn't say, for he will remove your son, me'acharai, from following me, ela ki yasir et bincha bagomer, but it says this regarding if your daughter marries his son. And of course, this is a long-standing tradition that in an intermarriage, if it's a Jewish woman who marries a non-Jewish man, the son is considered Jewish. On the other hand, if a Jewish man marries a non-Jewish woman, the offspring is not automatically considered Jewish, but has to convert. One would have to go through the action of some kind of formal version in that regard. And so
From
here
what point did that happen?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
From what point did that happen?
Well, I mean, if we're saying that right. So if we know this through rabbinic times, but what this is suggesting then is that this is a very ancient understanding, based on the wording of the Torah here. And we know that the Torah itself, right, the words of the Torah are very early. We consider them very early, and certainly, I mean, again, they're considered to predate the actual conquest of the land of Israel. So,
what about Moses' sons?
Right, good. So the point is that, very good question. So the understanding is that actually Jethro converted to Judaism, and again, in this particular case, we know that the women in this particular case would ascribe to the religion of their husbands. But in this case that we're talking about here, in the context here, where we're talking about the Canaanites, the assumption is that they didn't. I mean, our best example is Ruth, right? Ruth was actually a Moabite, right? So, you know, and we know that King David, ultimately, she was King David's great-grandmother, I believe great-grandmother. So again, this is not taking into account sincere conversion. This is assuming that the woman in this case is going to hold on to her religion.
Is Ruth considered to have made a conversion when she, said, yes, Naomi, I'm going with you?
Right. That is the classic statement where she says, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. You know, whither you go, I will go. That's sort of understood as the classic statement of conversion, completely throwing her lot with her mother-in-law. Yeah. She is the classic convert, which is interesting, right? That we allow for that we don't just take this statement for what it's worth and say no exceptions, etc. We allow for the fact that there's a possibility of motivation. But here, of course, the context is we're talking about, nations and cultures and things like that, and not so much individuals.
Well, okay, so currently
Yes,
there are several denominations of Judaism that allow for patrilineal descent.
right. And it contradicts this. Yes. I believe it's only in the Reform movement that allows for that. And it was, yeah,
Reconstructionist to
I'm, I'm sorry.
Reconstructionist.
Oh, okay,
Reconstruct.
Reconstructionism as well. Okay, thank you. You're educating me. I appreciate you telling me. Yeah, it's what can I say? The older I get, the more complicated I recognize and shaded these things are. So I think we'll just have to leave it where it's at right now. But it obviously, cries out for further interpretation. And there is going on. Ki imko tasulahim, however, right, you shall do such to them. Mizbechotehem titotsu, you shall tear down their altars. Umatsevo tam tishaberu, and again you shall smash their sacred pillars. Va'asherehem tigadeum, and you shall cut up, right, their asherahs. An asherah is a tree grown for worship, to worship this tree. Ufsilehem tisrafun ba'esh, and you shall burn their statues with fire, in the fire. In other words, again, an attempt to eradicate this notion of idolatry. Mizbechotehem. So he says that a mizbech, the difference between a mizbech and a matzeva, is a mizbechotehem shel binyan. It's something that is constructed, right? A mizbech, an altar is constructed. Matzeva is even achad. It's one stone. So it's also an altar, but it's an altar made out of one stone. Va'asherehem. So he says, ilanot, trees she'ovdinutam, which are worshipped. Ki am kadosh atah Hashem Elokecha, for you are a sanctified nation to the Lord your God. So, this idea of kadosh has to do with dedicated. It has to do with uniqueness. It has to do with basically loyal. Loyal is probably going far, but kadosh, the idea of sanctified means special, unique, that kind of idea. Right, that is supposed to be the relationship of Israel to its God. Bachar Adonai Elohecha, in you the Lord your God chose liot lo la'am skula, to be a treasured nation for him. Mikol hamim, from all the nations, asher al pnei hadama, which are over the surface of the earth. Going on. Lo merubchem, and this is actually a very touching statement that is added here. Lo merubchem mikol ha'amim chashak. Okay, not on account of the fact that you're numerous from all the nations. It's not because you were the largest of all the nations. Chashak Hashem bachem. Did the Lord your God desire you? Vayivchar bachem, and chose you. Ki atem hama'at mikol ha'amim, because you are in fact the smallest of all nations. And there is a beautiful Rashi on this that we're going to look at right now. Lo merubchen. So he says, on the one hand, kipshuto. We can understand it simply in its own terms, right? That God didn't choose the Jewish people because they were more numerous than other nations. Umidrasho, but the midrashic interpretation is lefi she'ein atem magdilim atzmechem. In other words, you don't lo merubchem, you don't aggrandize yourself. Lahagdil means to consider yourself, to make yourself, to show off, that kind of thing, or praise yourselves or something. Right? Keshe'ani mashpia lachem tova, when I give you goodness, when I deal out goodness to you, you don't say to yourselves, well, that's because I'm better than everybody else. That's why God is blessing me this way, right? And that's why the Lord your God has desired you, is because when things go well, you don't aggrandize yourselves. Ki atem hameat, right? So here this ki means actually rather, right? Right, because rather hameat, and again in taking the merubchem and hameat ma'atim, right, little, hamima'atim atemchem, you diminish yourselves, kagon Avraham, right, just as Abraham, Sha'amar, who said in Genesis chapter 18, va'anochi afar va'efer, right, in confronting God about the cities of Sodom, he says, while I am but dust and ashes, right, understanding exactly who we are in the presence of the divine. Uchagon Moshe, likewise Moses Aaron and Aaron, Sha'amru, they said in Exodus chapter 16, V'nachnu ma, as for us, what are we? Lo Nebuchadnezzar, but not like Nebuchadnezzar, Sha'amar, who said, and this is in Isaiah 14, Adameh le'olyon, I can compare myself to the Most High. The Sancheriv and Sennacherib, the ruler of Assyria, Shinamar, he says, and this is in Isaiah 36, Mi bechol eloi ha'aratzot, right? Who is like all the gods of the nations? In other words, talking about himself in that way, that there isn't any God that can stop him from doing what he wants to do. Vechiram and Hiram, Shamar, he said, and this is in Ezekiel 28, El Ani, I am God, Moshav Elohim Yashavti, I have dwelt in the place, in the habitation of God. Ki atem hama'at, because you are rather small. Hare ki, and here this word ki, meshamesh belashon daha. So here the word ki means for indeed, for, as opposed to because, or that, or something. So this word ki, as Rashi mentions elsewhere, has several different meanings depending on its context. Going on. Ki me ahavat Hashem etchem. So here we have this ki here, meaning rather, right? But rather me ahavat Hashem etchem, or but, right, from the love of the Lord your God, the fact that the Lord your God loved you, umishomro et shashvuah asher nishba lavodachem, and from his guarding the oath which he made to your ancestors. Did the Lord your God take you out with an outstretched, with a strong arm? Right, that's referring, of course, to the Exodus from Egypt, that moment when God rescued the slaves, the Hebrew slaves. Vayiftecha beit avadim, and he redeemed you from the house of slavery, miyad Paro, from the hand of Pharaoh, Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt. And again, I mentioned that the word hand always has to do with it has the connotation of power. Going here, ki me'ahavat Hashem. Hare ki, here we go. So he says, in fact, here, the word ki, mishamesh belashon ella, here it has the meaning of rather. Lo merubchem chashak Hashem bachem. In other words, understanding the whole few verses, it says it wasn't because it wasn't on account of your being numerous that the Lord your God desired you, Ella, but rather me'avat Hashem echem, but simply because the Lord your God loved you. Umishamro et hashvuah, and his guarding his, in other words, keeping his oath, mechamat, in other words, on account, shamro et hashvuah, because he guards the oath he made. He's going to keep that oath, that promise he made to your ancestors. And we'll stop here. And again, to give you any opportunity to comment on what we've done today. So, okay. I'm going to stop the share. Okay. Any comments, any thoughts for the record? Lanny, how you doing? I can't hear you because you're muted.
Mute. I'm okay, Mordecai. How about you?
Okay, well,
Yeah.
can't complain.
Yeah.
Appreciate very, very much these moments that we have to study together. But I'm interested in your reactions, if you have any reactions, any of you. Just come off mute.
If you just follow the commandments and love God with all your heart and all your soul, all your might, you're okay.
Right. Yep, that is the idea, as best as we can, Harlan. Yeah, I know. It's an interesting, if you don't read this stuff, then you're not aware of it, as challenging as it may be. And it is challenging, but
Yeah.
it's there to try and guide us. That's why we call it, the Torah. It's supposed to guide us in our lives, in our complicated lives.
Yeah, well, you have a choice, good or
Yes,
bad. You have the choice.
right, we do. That's what Moses is going to tell the Israelites. Yes, David.
If God created everything,
What do
Go
you mean
on.
if? What do you mean if?
correct. God
Assuming.
God created everything, and why would He create nations that believe in idols?
Good question. So I don't know
And
that.
I know this about free will, but that's one part of Judaism that I have that it's hard for me to wrap my arms around it.
Understood. Understood. So that is, unfortunately, that is the risk one takes in giving people free will.
You will.
But on the other hand, it's very important to understand that an explanation is not an excuse. And the truth is, God says, on account of these nations behaving like this, that they are being driven out. And the more important lesson is that the same will happen to the Jewish people if, in fact, they behave in the same way. The reason why we have perhaps a little bit of an advantage has to do with Abraham, our patriarchs and matriarchs, and the way in which they understood and loved God and were faithful and loyal to God. And that's the reason why maybe we have a slight advantage. And the idea also that our our descendants also, if we act in a righteous way, have us to lean on as well. So there's an awareness of being connected to previous generations that certainly these days it's so easy to underestimate and not appreciate. So on the one hand, we don't believe in ancestor worship, but on the other hand, we certainly believe in the fact that we owe such a major debt to those who are no longer around. Now, as far as your specific question, David, I mean, it simply comes down to God did not force these people to engage in these kinds of ways. Uh, all of us have temptations. That's part of life, but it's also a way in which to gain respect and to gain worth, is the ability that we have to look at these temptations and overcome them. The rabbis often say, that God may have given us all these poisons in our lives, but in giving us the Torah, God also gave us the antidote. And while they may not have had the Torah in the way that we do, nevertheless, they also had wise people, I'm sure of it. Judith?
Well, we're talking about free will, where it says, the sins of the fathers I'll remember till the 1,000th generation.
Actually, no. No, it doesn't say
No.
that.
Well,
The
I don't know
sins, it
exactly.
doesn't. No, it's the third and fourth generations for the sins of the fathers, but it's the 1,000th generation for the loyalty and the goodness.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
But
Mercy to the 1,000th generation.
so the opposite of what I was thinking. Well,
Yes.
yes. But
Right.
even so, when we get so into individual in
Yes.
this, ethos that freedom of choice, each person does have freedom of choice. but what choices appear to us? The I don't know, the traumas, the conditioning, the teaching that we come out of limits our freedom of choice.
Right. It does. So they say that when you go to heaven, the very first question they ask you is, did you find time? Did you allot time to study Torah? So at least for Jews, that is, that's the question. As far as non-Jews are concerned, I don't know that it mentions anything in that regard, but since I also have a universalistic tendency and a universalistic belief as well, again, and to the extent that I understand a little bit about some of the other religions, I know that there's great wisdom there as well. And I think that, just as when it comes to our own children, we have to give them a sense of how special they are to us. And that's why the Torah, who's addressing essentially the Jewish people, wants us to understand how special we are to God. And I don't see it necessarily as a contradiction to other, what I think are great religions in the world. They are not idolatries.
Why,
Harlan,
Yeah.
you're off
why
mute.
would God punish the children for the parents that are bad?
Right. So
Generation after generation. That doesn't make sense.
okay. So here I will try and make a little bit of sense. First of all, God does not punish children if they choose not to follow their parents' behavior. Okay? Absolutely not. But what it is saying is that if they don't learn the lessons and they continue that behavior, they are going to have to bear the brunt of it. But I think the real message that's being given is a warning to us, right? That if we choose to act in a way that is disloyal or sinful, etc., and our children learn from us, they are going to pay, we're going to have to bear the responsibility that they will pay an even greater price. That we need to understand our responsibility as parents. And it's awesome, it really is. It's not an easy piece to have to bite on.
Yeah,
But
well, God says, love your parents. Well,
yes, he
if
does.
your parents are for God, how can you love your parents?
Okay, so here we go. So it's true. It does talk in the Ten Commandments of honoring your mother and father. So, but in Leviticus, there's a statement that says, interestingly enough, it says, you shall fear your mother and your father and keep my Sabbaths. It's all in one sentence. And so the understanding is that even though you should be deeply respectful of your parents, if they tell you to do something wrong, you still have to do what is right. In a case where there's a conflict, you have to do what's right. That being righteous actually overcomes the commandment to fear your parents. So it's actually there in the Torah that if you have that choice. Again, these are not easy passages to actually try to implement, but they're there. They're there. So I'm going to stop here and let's do that.